Hey friends, today I thought I would talk a little bit about cutting up your fabric for a woolly petals pattern. These tips will probably work really good for other patterns too, but I thought I would specifically talk about woolly petals patterns and this cutting video I did make for the ghost party sew along. I'm going to walk you through this pattern and how to cut things, and this will help you for tips for all of Woollypetals patterns because I write my patterns a little bit differently. But first, I'm Kristin, the designer, creator, pattern designer behind Woollypetals. I love all things crafty, have dabbled and will dabble in lots of different crafts, try just about anything, but my heart is always first and foremost for quilting. So that is what you'll see most about the Woollypetals channel is quilting and occasionally other little bits of crafts. So let's dive into the pattern today. For proprietary reasons, I have changed this pattern a little bit in that I've taken out all the actual dimensions, but we do talk about pieces because I wanted to talk about how to read a Woollypetals pattern and how to kind of decipher how to cut things. For Woollypetals patterns, so many of them have a scrappy background. Not all, but a lot of them. So in terms of fabric, I don't often give you exactly what to cut from each fabric because I love scrappy patterns and I really prefer to make it as scrappy as possible. So while I do give you fabric requirements for your pattern in fat quarter terms, I love to see when you throw in a bunch of extra fabric. Say you want to buy a bundle of fabric or a kit for the ghost party quilt specifically. This is a bundle of fabric from Ruby Star. Moda gifted it to me. It's called Good Spirits. I am making a ghost party quilt out of it that I'm giving away at the end of the sew along this year in 2024. So a bundle is a great way to get a lot of fabrics that are very coordinated. With prepackaged fabric bundles from a company, like a whole line of fabric, I do love to throw in a few extras just to give a little bit of a twist. Like with this one, which Moda gifted me this one too. It's Noor by Allie K Designs. And my thought is I might combine these two into one super scrappy quilt. We'll see kind of how it hashes out. Otherwise, I might give one away. So most of the time, a full line of fabric is going to have more than the allotted amount of fat quarters for one of my patterns. The ghost party specifically says 12 fat quarters for the background and 8 fat quarters for the ghost. And then there's a little extra for the eyes and mouth, the stars. Not too much fabric needed there, but in, say, this Good Spirits bundle, we have far more than 12 prints of background, what I would suggest is background fabric, but not quite 8 prints of low volume ghost fabric. So there are, 5 there, and we're going to throw another one, so that's 6. This could waffle either way, ghost or background, and the rest of these I'm going to say are pretty solidly in the background section, which let's count them real quick. Okay, fast forward, there's 19 of these. So that's awesome. But in terms of cutting your background, how do I do that? And there's not quite 8 of the low volumes. So in terms of cutting your ghost, how do you do that? And so this kind of goes for any of my patterns that have a scrappy background. And often some of my patterns have scrappy like things in the middle. For instance, my squirrel pattern is both scrappy squirrel, scrappy background. My snowman pattern, scrappy snowman, scrappy background. So you can see there's several instances among my patterns that you may have to determine how much to cut of each of your fabrics. Because when you get to the cutting info for a pattern, the ghost party is a little bit different in terms of patterns for me. I have modeled a few of my patterns since after it, but I do a whole page with cutting for the whole quilt. which is not unusual in a pattern, except that I also give you pages of each ghost so that you could make an individual ghost, or this is what you use to lay out the 3 of each type of ghost, Boone, Jack, and Anna. And just at a glance, it's nice to see what pieces, what sizes go where as you're laying things out. But if you want to cut out the whole quilt at once, you would go to this page, which is about the whole quilt. And a lot of my patterns have this, even if they do have other pages like the ghost. Like my Enchanted Forest pattern has individual pages for all the trees and the little snowman, but it also has a page where you have everything you need to cut out for the whole quilt. Because let's be honest, some people like to cut out the whole quilt at once and some people don't. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. I'm kind of a mix. I really love to do a test block, and I know a lot of you do too. So often I will only cut enough for a test block just because it's like, do I want to use this fabric? Is this the right combo? What's it going to look like? How am I going to cut this? And then I might go back and cut out a bunch. I don't often cut out a full quilt at once. That is kind of one of my flaws because I really don't enjoy cutting. So I kind of break it up and I'll do enough to do a handful of blocks and do some more. My only recommendation with that is to cut out an equal amount every time of all your prints you're using. So in my patterns, I give you information of how many pieces of each size, like for the background on the ghost party, there's 2 different sizes. You can see here, because it's proprietary information for my pattern, I took out the actual dimensions. So we're just gonna look at piece A and piece B. You want to cut 267 of piece A, and say we have 18 fabrics. So what you're going to do is you're going to take 267 and divide it by 18, and that is going to tell you how much of each fabric you're going to cut. So I did not do the math before this, but let's figure that out real quick. Okay, grabbing my computer and doing the math, that's 14.8333333 pieces per fabric for 18 different fabrics. I, of course, am going to round that up to 15, and I'm going to cut 15 of piece A from each of my background fabrics. I'm going to do the same thing for piece B, and that's really easy because 18 going into 36 is 2, so you cut 2 of piece B from every background fabric. So that's a pretty easy way to figure out for any of the Woollypetals patterns when I don't specifically say fabric A, fabric B, fabric C, cut this much of. There are plenty of patterns I do, but when I have a pattern with a scrappy background, I often give you the total amount of pieces of the same size so you can figure out, based on how many different fabric prints you use, how many of each you need to cut. You're going to do the same thing for the ghost fabric. It's a little bit different because there's more pieces for the ghosts, but you're going to do the same thing. Take the number and divide it by the amount of ghost fabric. So say we used 6 and you divided it by 180. You're not going to have enough fabric if you only got fat quarters. That would be 30 pieces from each of these 6 fabrics. And that's what you would cut for piece A. And then you would do the same thing for the rest of the pieces. That's why I say you definitely want to do 8 fat quarters for your ghosts, low volume bodies, or whatever you're using for your bodies. I said this before, I really love a scrappy block, a scrappy pattern. So while I do give you the fabric requirements, they're on page 3 of the pattern. I give you for a single ghost, if you're using a solid fabric or going scrappy, for both options, the quilt or a single ghost. And of course, you're probably not going to use a solid fabric for the background, but it kind of gives you an idea of the equivalent amount of fabric if you're going scrappy or doing something like the checkerboard version or things like that. Personally, I want more than my fabric quantities here. For scrappy, 12 fat quarters, 8 fat quarters, I want more, because if you are counting around one of the blocks of the background, you can see, and we can go to one of the blocks here. Let's go to Boone. You have 24 background pieces. And so 12 prints, it's going to be each print is going to be repeated twice in the background. If you're pretty consistent, sometimes that will change because you will forget and do it differently. I made my Ghost in the Garden mini quilt with not a single repeat on the back fabric. That was kind of a test block before I made my Ghost in the Garden quilt. And I just really love that variety of having so many fabrics. Where I land typically is maybe around 18 prints for a background. So you're repeating a few, but you're not repeating a ton. It's really hard though to tell fabric shops who are doing kits and to tell people they need to buy 18 fat quarters, because there is definitely leftovers from your fat quarters when you're making this pattern. So if you have more fat quarters, you're going to have even more left over from each. And to reduce the actual size you're getting, it gets tricky into quarter yards, which not everybody likes, or into fat eighths, which then you'd have to go up to 24 fabrics. So usually when I'm deciding what my fabric requirements are going to be, I am basing that on just the ease of kitting a pattern, the ease of picking out fabrics for a pattern. But I always recommend to go scrappier if you love that look. So this would be another look at a different bundle. So let's take a look at this. We have 16, if I counted correctly, prints, which are all very cute, very like spooky, but floral. There's some snakes in there. And then we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. This is questionable background or ghost. For the ghost, I potentially would swap a few of these into the background and maybe add in a few white-based low volumes to this, because we only have one that is like tone-on-tone low volume, and it might be nice to have another like that. And then some of these are pretty bold. So whatever amount of fabrics you are using for your background, take your total piece count and divide by the quantity of fabrics. 267, like we said, by 18 is, I'm going to round up to 15 pieces I'm going to cut from each of these fat quarters. I am then going to use the rest of that fabric to piece my 30 stars. Any leftovers go into my 30 paper pieced stars. Now the Ghost Party pattern, I've had quite a few questions on this, and it is referenced in these paragraphs, but it might be hard to understand if you are newer to quilting or have never made a quilt like this. It actually says, if you are sewing up all the pieced blocks via FPP only, cut out the amounts in the cutting below in parentheses and then FPP the pieced blocks using remaining fabric. If you are FPPing, which is foundation paper piece, you can FPP this block right here, that basically an HST, but there is an FPP version. You can FPP these little snowballed points, and you can FPP the eyes and the mouth. So if you are going to FPP those parts of the ghost themselves, you are only going to cut out what is in parentheses. And then over here, it tells you how much of each FPP block you are going to make for the whole quilt. It shows that for each individual block as well, and it also has, if you are traditionally piecing, this first number, if you are FPPing, this second number for background squares. And then you will use the rest of your fabric to FPP those sections. The stars are not included in those numbers. The stars are completely separate. So that kind of talks you through the pattern. I hope that made sense. Please reach out if it does not. If you're newer to quilting, it may be a little bit different than other patterns you've made. So I feel like you can use all of these tips for a lot of the Woollypetals patterns. What we're going to talk about next is how to actually cut your fabric. What I like to do is, first, I like to iron all my fabric. And I know that's not for everybody, but For me, it really helps with my accuracy. So ironing your fabric will definitely help in accuracy and getting all of your lines to line up properly. And I'm not saying it's going to make you perfect, but it's just a step in the right direction. So I'm going to go iron all of my fabric, which does take a little bit of time. And I have to say that bundles like this that are done at the factory, I 100% always iron. Fabric that is on my wall, I always iron because it's been folded like that for a long time. Those creases are set in. But I actually just ironed a half yard of fabric that I bought a week or so ago, and it was just kind of folded in half once, laying over a chair waiting for the project. And it literally did not have any wrinkles. The only crease it had was where, when it's a half yard, it's folded, down the middle and the selvages meet. And that is the only crease I wouldn't iron out if you're using half yard, quarter yards with that fold that comes off the bolt like that. And I will tell you why when we get to cutting. So I'll see you back here after we do a little bit of ironing. Okay, I popped you over to my ironing board, and I just thought I would iron a couple. How I am doing this is I am just using pressure. If you want to use a little bit of steam to get those wrinkles out, or some sort of spray. I know a lot of quilters use starch. That's something I actually have never used, but I know it just produces a beautiful, crisp piece of fabric. So just that little bit ironed out all those big creases, and it makes for so much easier cutting. So I'm just going to race through this stack. I thought I would share with you a half yard. I thought I would grab a Halloween related half yard. It's actually surprisingly hard to find a full half yard in my stash. I now buy more 1 yard pieces, and then my half yard pieces often have a chunk cut out of them. So this is a half yard, and you can see it's just folded in half, salvage to salvage, just how it comes off of the bolt. Because it is really hard to cut that full width of fabric, which is 40 to 42 inches, I leave that fold of how it comes off the bolt, and I just iron it. Sometimes I end up having to iron it flat when I get to that point on my strip of fabric and then cut out a piece from it, but that's not a big deal to me. I would rather have this easy to cut. Sometimes with the half yards, it just takes a little bit more ironing because you're going through two layers. And I would say it doesn't have to be perfectly flat, but getting out any creases that stick up and hinder your cutting. And I find that so much in factory cut fat quarters. No shame to them. It's totally fine. Actually, I probably shouldn't show you on a black. It's hard to see things on black. But they must do some sort of large press or iron to get those creases, because often there is at least a couple creases in a fat quarter that is really tough and kind of sticks up. Like when I lay this down flat, it's like tinted up. And I do not want that when I'm cutting, because it makes cutting trickier if you don't smooth that flat as you're cutting. And for someone who does not love the cutting part of making a quilt, I want to get that part over as quick as possible. So I'm not going to pay attention to all those folds and imperfections in the fabric as I'm cutting. And I like to stack my fabric as I'm cutting. So ironing it is best for me. So that's how I do a full half yard piece, or if it was a quarter yard piece instead of a fat quarter, leaving that fold off the bolt. And I will show you on this one as well, even though it's not going in our quilt. Maybe we'll make the stars out of it. That might be kind of fun. I will show you how to cut a wider piece of fabric than a fat quarter when I am cutting. And I actually do have some other videos on cutting on my YouTube channel that you are welcome to check out too. One is from my free course the New Star Beginner Quilt Course. That's based on my blog, woollypetals.com, and on YouTube. There are a lot of videos from that on my channel, and there is one specifically about cutting. And there is also a video from last year, 2023's Ghost Party Sew Along, that is about cutting as well. So you can check out both of those if you need a little bit more. But after I get done ironing here, we're going to go back to the cutting table, and I'm going to give you an aerial view of how I cut out fabric for the Ghost Party quilt. And this is really how I cut out fabric for any pattern these days. So you can use these tips for a lot of different patterns. Okay, I have all of my backgrounds fabrics ready to go. You can see, I mean, they're not perfect. There's definitely still a little bit of a line or crease in them, but it's way better than it was, and it's going to work way better for cutting. So I'm going to just put my stack over here. I actually have 3 in a stack. I would consider more, depending on how how sharp my blade is. But for today, my blade is not very old. I'm just going to do 3 because that is just a little bit more than if you were cutting like a folded piece of fabric like off the bolt. So I have them stacked up with a fat quarter. What I want to do is line up the salvages, and that gives me a way to do a registration cut. If you've ever cut a quilt out, which I'm sure you have, or if you have made a lot of quilts or watched any of my cutting videos, probably any of anybody's cutting videos, you know that you want to start with a square corner to cut. So what I like to do is cut strips of fabric across the widest point of the height of my squares. So for our piece A, I'm going to cut strips that are that tall, and then I'm going to subcut those strips into the squares, but they're already going to be the height of the square, so I just have to do the width of the square. So if I need 15 piece A from each of my fabric, I'm going to see how many I get out of a width of a fat quarter, and I think it's 6, so I might need 3 strips. So if I get 12 out of 2 strips and I only need 3 more piece A's, I might only cut those out and not cut out a strip. Then I have a little bit more room to work with for your FPP stars, but I'm not overly concerned about that. I have plenty of fabric for making the stars. So let's see how many we get from each strip of fabric. First, I'm going to cut my registration line. I'm going to cut off my salvages because that's the side I lined up, since they lined up so well. Oops, sorry. This side doesn't always line up perfectly. You can even see, actually, by the time you get to the top fabric, it is taller than the bottom 2 fabrics, or wider. So even factory cut fat quarters are not going to be perfect. That was a little bit backwards for me to cut. I usually like to cut on this side of the ruler, but just so I didn't put my arm in front. Once I get my first registration line cut, I am going to cut the next side, which is going to be the bottom for me. It would usually be one of the sides at a 90-degree angle from your registration. I just want to make sure that I pull my ruler down enough not to waste fabric, but not too much. Like, I don't want to waste any of this fabric, but I want to make sure I'm cutting straight all the pieces. So if you're being careful when you're lining up your pieces like this, you could put the smallest one on top so you can see, and just make sure that you get all the pieces cut. So I'm going to cut the height of my piece A, which is the most we're going to cut from our background fabric, and just cut a strip. So that's what I'm going to do multiple times for however many I need, but we're going to try and see how many of our squares we get from a strip. So I have a stripology ruler, which I love this tool when I'm cutting lots of pieces. And like you know, I said earlier, so many of my patterns have scrappy background or a lot of the same size pieces. So it is an excellent investment for me. But essentially, instead of having to do this, where you have a strip and then you have to line up your ruler and cut and then move and line up your ruler and cut, which is fine. That is great if you love cutting. That might be an excellent thing for you to do because it's a very methodical process. I then, after I cut, like to stack my fabrics up in matching colors because when I'm pulling for the background of a ghost party block, I can then pull easily and get a nice distribution of color. With a stripology ruler, you actually line up your strip along one of these horizontal lines just to keep it straight. And then these cut grooves are every half an inch. And so you can count out. So I put my first one. This is actually best to do if you are cutting the whole strip. I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to line up that first cutting groove on the edge of your fabric. So I'm going to measure over however much I need and cut in the first groove, and then I'm going to measure over again to my next mark. That will give me the right size for what I am cutting out. So we did get 6 of our squares from each fat quarter width. And then I have some extra. I'm going to measure that. I don't know if that's a full square. And if it's not a full square, it is a great spot to cut any of your smaller pieces. For the background, we only have the piece B as a smaller piece. And this actually is just a full square for this one. But for these, it's not because they were a little bit shorter. So I just take a smaller ruler then, and I'm going to cut this down into as many of the smaller piece B pieces so that I'm using this extra. You could also throw this aside, use more of it, and then like this is a little bit of waste, but that's fine for me. I don't really mind that. So now I have a start of my squares for my background, and I'm going to continue cutting each piece of background fabric. I would need 15 big piece A's and 2 little piece B's from every background fabric. So I'm going to continue cutting that, and then I will move on to the ghosts and do the exact same thing with the ghost fabric. And then I'll move on to the eye and mouth and do the exact same thing. When I am cutting a pattern out, I take the largest piece from whatever fabric I'm cutting. So in this case, it is piece A, and then I cut out that strip size. And then I can subcut that into whatever the width of that size is, which in this case it's squares. And then say from a strip, I only need 3 of these. And then I'm going to have leftover strips, but that's okay because then I'm going to go down to the next smallest piece and cut the next smallest piece from those strips. And then when I've cut all of those out, if I still have some left, I'm going to go down to the next smallest piece after that and cut those pieces. So essentially you will have some waste, but doing this way you will have far less waste than if you cut all of piece A size strips and then you cut all of piece B size strips and so on. You'll have a lot of those strips left over. So I'm going to cut up all my background fabric, and then I'm going to go to my ghost fabric. It's pretty simple. Please ask questions of me. I really do love to help. I would rather you send me a message on your Etsy purchase and ask a question to clarify something and get some help from me. I understand my patterns aren't for everybody. Quilters, sew differently. We cut differently. We have different tips and tricks. I love that about us because otherwise we're just clones. But just know that I am always here to help. Check out all my other YouTube videos. Sometimes I have help on my blog. Sometimes in the pattern, I have a private video that only people who purchase that pattern can link to. on YouTube. You can't find it on my channel. That specifically happens in some of my newer patterns, I think over the last couple of years, and when it is a little bit trickier. Not everybody reads through the information on Etsy before they purchase, and not everybody reads through the whole pattern. That is another big tip. I should have said that at the beginning of this video. Read through the whole pattern. I know it's hard to understand when you're not actually making. I am a super visual person, and I really like to see how things come together. But if I've read through the whole pattern first, my mind starts to click a lot faster with how things go as I'm actually sewing a pattern. I try to say that at the beginning of all of my patterns. So I am so glad you were here today. I hope you took away a little nugget of information that you didn't know, or that like you had heard in the past and were like, oh yes, I should try that. Or you learned something all new today. And I hope I explained my patterns a little bit further.